All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to the first official episode of the Modern Meathead podcast. So I'm here with my good friend and training partner, Ethan, and we'll get to Ethan in a moment. Many of you, if you have been following me for any length of time, have probably seen Ethan through the stories or through the posts. He's the big dude that I'm always with, and that I often talk about in the context of pro bodybuilding. So first things first, just a little bit of background on why we decided to do this in the first place and why we, kind of the direction that we're headed, because I think it's helpful just as a general framework to lay something out that's a little bit more clear as far as like what our goals are with the podcast and just talking in the first place. So I talk to Ethan very, very often, and we bounce a lot of ideas back and forth off of each other constantly. We constantly question, each other's opinions on things, stances, whether it's biomechanics, anatomy, training, programming, nutrition, pharmacology, whatever. We talk about an entire a host of different topics, and I think that we offset each other very well. So certain tendencies that I have, Ethan kind of, can reality check me on it, and vice versa. And we also are a little bit more specialized in terms of the topics that we've really dove super deeply into. So me being more on the anatomy, the biomechanics side of things, Ethan much more sort of broad scopes bodybuilding and all things related to bodybuilding, but also just a lot of like psychology stuff that I think is super interesting and helpful for anyone that really likes, to train a lot. So our plan for this podcast is basically just to have the conversations that we would normally have on a regular day, a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in the city, and just kind of bring them to you all, and to hopefully provide some degree of value and some degree of information that maybe you haven't heard before. Because a lot of the things that initially, when I met Ethan, I started to learn about, I wasn't really hearing anyone else talk about. And Ethan is someone who stays far away from social media for good reason, I think. And so I think sort of bringing him in a little bit more of a public space to be able to kind of talk about some of the stuff that he, likes and knows a lot about is going to be super helpful for you on. I'm really, really excited for people to actually get to hear you on a more consistent basis, because it is, I think, especially in our little niche of our little gym, a super cool thing that everyone in the gym really benefits from. So Ethan and I met originally just because I started working at the same gym that he was working at, and that's pretty much how it started. And he really pulled me into the bodybuilding hypertrophy realm. Actually, prior to meeting Ethan, in my earlier days of lifting, I was a power lifter. I never competed, but I just like to do the squat, bench, and deadlift thing, and that's actually kind of what drove me into the biomechanics stuff to begin with. So I actually was not really involved in anything bodybuilding related until I met you. I think like 2020 or something like that. And since then we've just kind of become closer and cross paths in more ways than just the information stuff. So that's pretty much it for the intro. Maybe the only other thing that I wanted to cover, that I think is a really cool concept that we're going to be playing around with, is, traditional podcast format is basically like we invite this guest on that's well known by the potential viewer, and we interview them. And I think that's something that we'll probably do along the way, and I think will be valuable just to kind of pick certain people's brains that a lot of people know and are experts or perceived experts in any particular field. But something we also wanted to do is actually invite guests and followers of me and or myself, or just anyone who wants to reach out to me, to actually come onto the podcast to ask questions, on their own behalf, right? So I think it's a really potentially cool idea that not only the individual who is coming onto the podcast will benefit from, but I think a lot of people end up having a lot of very similar questions. And oftentimes those questions don't get answered when you're talking to someone who is at a really, really high level of expertise in any particular domain. I think oftentimes what ends up happening in those instances is a lot of the viewers tend to get lost or tend to not necessarily extract as much value from those instances. So I definitely want to do those kinds of talks. I'm totally open to also just, having one-on-ones here if we want to just take questions from elsewhere. And then, I also definitely want to just get random people on, people who will submit, questions through a form and then actually be here live recording with us. So that's kind of broad scopes, just introductory stuff. And I want to pass it over to Ethan now to begin with, and just kind of talk a little bit about Ethan's background and, staying away from the generalized elevator pitch of what you do, as we discussed. I kind of want, Ethan, the viewers to know how you got into bodybuilding in the first place, not necessarily from the perspective of like, why was it that you started lifting, but just sort of what age specifically did you start lifting? How long have you been lifting? And how have you progressed over time insofar as your journey from person who starts lifting at a young age to personal trainer who is training other people to now pro bodybuilder and trainer? Kind of give us the outline insofar as your history, or just anything else that you think along that sort of timeline may be helpful for people to know, to get an idea of kind of where you're coming from and what your some of your important background things are.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ben, thanks for finally making this happen. I know the past couple of years we've done a lot together, from training together, not just at Hype, but also driving like a couple hours every day to train at other gyms. It's really been a journey, man, and not one I think that many people besides you and I have really got a chance to see. I think because of your age, people think that maybe like you haven't been in the trenches as much as some of the other guys, but I know with the power lifters that you've worked with in the past, the bodybuilders that I see you help in person, myself included. First of all, just from an orthopedic perspective, I know where I was a couple years ago, to where I am today, and there have been a number of people have been big influences, but you've really been one of the top influences for me to still be training today and doing what I love. So just first of all, thank you for being there with me over the past few years. You were there when I turned pro. That was really, really fun. And you were there afterwards, through the worst part of my back injuries. And man, just in like the few years that we've known each other, like a lot has transpired. And I think it's exciting that we get a chance to tell some of those stories and just share our experiences, both in terms of what we've shared together, and then also the way we've been able to help others over the past few years. So it is exciting that we're finally getting together and being able to share this with a larger audience. So
agreed, Ben. Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. So as far as my background, it's funny, like walking through New York City, if you're a muscular person, in a 15-minute walk, like if you're over 250 pounds, under 15% body fat, I would say on average in a 15-minute walk, you're going to get stopped twice. If you're in, even like a reasonably, let's say sketchy area of town. Like the sketchier the area, the more likely you are to get stopped. And it's going to be at least 2 times in a 15-minute period. And there's very common questions that you can expect to get when getting stopped on the street. I think everyone would be familiar with the like, how much do you bench, bro question, but I would say that's actually not the most popular question. The most popular question is, how long have you been lifting for?
Oh, I didn't even know that one. I thought the
100%,
okay,
hands down the most common question, how long you've been lifting for. And after getting asked these, that's a pretty straightforward question. There's not like, my mind doesn't have to go through these cartwheels and jump through hoops to, like when someone asks me what I bench, I have to go through this sort of equation of like, do I tell them that I don't bench press? Do I make up a number? Like, what's the level of engagement that I'm ready for and that this person is ready to receive at this moment? So there's some really quick like algebra that goes through my mind, in that equation. But the how many years I've been lifting is pretty straightforward. Like, I would say the first time I stepped into a weight room would have been like 7th or 8th grade, middle school, getting ready for football. So it is that, common story of like wanting to get bigger and stronger for sports, specifically football. That led me to the weight room. And then fast forward, like, 5 years later, it was like, I love the process of training more than I really love the sport itself. Had some, significant shoulder injuries at the time, had about dozen or so shoulder dislocations where I just, pop it back in myself. Got surgery on both shoulders, and then really had to, make a life decision of like, am I going to pursue, football, or am I going to pursue, bodybuilding? And by bodybuilding, it wasn't specifically like, oh, a career as a bodybuilder. It was more like, if I choose to pursue bodybuilding, I'm going to build a life around that. And it's not just the sport itself, but it's really more so pursuing fitness as a career. And that's why I chose to go to Springfield College. My research kind of led me to the conclusion that that was the most applied place to do exercise science, where I would be doing internships, going to, pro sports teams, collegiate sports teams, places like, Mike Boyle, Eric Cressy. And that's kind of where my head was at for a few years there. It was kind of like the maybe collegiate strength coach kind of realm. So that's really where my education started, was in Springfield College, exercise science, very strength conditioning minded, not so much just like purely bodybuilding. Even though in the back of my mind, like those early days of lifting from say 13 years old up to when I went to college at 17, 18, it was very much like watching the Ronnie Coleman videos, the Jay Cutler videos, and my training for football was like probably 20% sports performance, probably 80% just old school bodybuilding. So at that time, I met a lot of the top, bodybuilders in the sport, trained with some of the coaches, just very quickly surrounded myself with the like key players in that field. So I'm sure at times we'll get into, more specific stories. Like I won't get into, any of those details now, but the answer is I've been training since I was about 13, 31 now. I turned pro in 2021. So, that was September. So yeah, we're about a year and a half post. Had some, major injuries, out of the weeds with that at the moment. And I'm currently training for the 2024 New York Pro in May. So I have about 6 months of off season left, and then another, 20 weeks or so come the new year to diet down for that competition.
All right, cool. So there's a lot of stuff there that we could potentially dive into. One of the things that I think would be very helpful for people to know, and something that I think is important to know about you specifically, is you have a very broad spanning array of educational influence. So you've learned from a lot of different people. You over the years, you've really been adamant about pursuing certain models and certain systems, learning and getting everything out of them that you can, and then sort of extracting what you think is useful to you. And you've gone through all different kinds of people and models, from the rehab world to the bodybuilding world to sort of everything in between. So tell us a little bit about sort of your introduction, what sort of introduced you to the educational experience in relationship to fitness. What was your sort of entry point? And then maybe some of the details as far as like how that transitioned, or, what your sort of bumping around path was, because you've ended up at this place that's really like, I hate the word holistic, but like you've taken a very holistic approach to bodybuilding. You have like 10 different coaches working on 10 different things. And I think that's important for people to know that you have a lot of information in a lot of domains. So yeah, just kind of start with, again, whatever your introduction to, because I don't even know like what your introduction to education was, and then sort of the pathway, to where we are now.
Well, this will probably be, a little bit unique to some of your listeners and probably yourself included, but my initial introduction was actually like the physical magazine. right? So like the Muscular Development, the
You're
Flex
really, yeah, you're
magazine.
really dating yourself here, man. It's
Yeah.
funny because I'm only 7 years younger than you, but like I never picked up a single magazine.
Yeah, I mean, specifically remember the very first, bodybuilding magazine I ever bought. It was like a throwback edition, so Lee Haney was on the cover, but to say that like Lee Haney was on the cover of the first magazine I ever read would really seem like it was a lot. I was a lot older than 31, so I don't want to give the impression that he was actually competing at the time. But there was a throwback edition. I was with my stepdad in the grocery store. I can still picture that first one. And then, of course, from there, I had the subscriptions. I had a subscription to Flex, Muscular Development, and Muscle and Fitness, and I would just read them cover to cover. The big competitors at the time were, of course, Ronnie Coleman, was in his like, sixth, seventh, eighth Olympia around that time. Jay Cutler was just about to sort of overtake him. You had guys like Dexter Jackson, Branch Warren. And, when I mentioned like Dexter Jackson, Branch Warren, Kai Green, one of the guys that was actually coaching them at the time was a guy named George Farah. And George was one of the, and still is, one of the most popular bodybuilding coaches. And just like, you've seen me do many times in the past few years, when there's something that like I've decided I'm going to dive deep into, like I'll just find the person. So George happened to live in Rochester, where I grew up. And getting ready for my first competition as a teenager, that's who I sought out. And it's really cool when people can feel that passion and energy behind a person, even like a young kid. They're willing to help. Like I think people would be really surprised just how much experienced and well-respected people in the field are willing to go out on a limb when they can really see that you're fully, committed to the process. So, George was a coach of mine early on. I was natural at the time, and stayed that way until 26, 27. But he was my first coach. There was a time where I went out to Venice Beach, California, trained with some of the pros out there. I trained with Charles Glass, who many people would know. He's another one who just like, we didn't have, a long-term relationship or anything, but the couple of times, that I was out there and training in Venice, like he was just, super accommodating. Like, I don't think he ever charged, me to train or to shadow him. There was a time where I was interning at Athletes Performance, which is now Exos, Mark Verstegen's company. They train a lot of guys and girls for, pro sports, Olympics, NFL combines, a big one. But when I was there, like I was training anyone from like the Chinese national basketball team, like their Olympic team, to like an Irish rugby player. There were a couple NBA guys there, there's an NFL guy. So I was interning out there, I want to say like my junior year of college. And on the weekends, I would go out to Gold's Gym Venice, train with the bodybuilders, learn from those guys. I would go to Metroflex gym out in Long Beach there. But then during the week, I'd be at Athletes Performance. So I was kind of this like, I was right in between. Do I identify myself as a bodybuilder, as a strength coach? Didn't really, in my heart, bodybuilding was always there. But at that time, from an education standpoint, I was still really branching out and not just staying down that traditional route of, what you see in the magazines. Because pretty quickly, I would say, from that age of 13 to 17, like in high school, you can read all the magazines, you can, watch all the DVDs. When Netflix first came out, it was a subscription model where they actually sent DVDs in the mail. So every week, my best friend and I at the time would watch what they call the Battle for the Olympia DVDs, which is where they just like filmed all the guys getting ready for the Olympia. And I would say after watching like, you know, a couple hundred hours of guys like do the same exercises, like eat the same meals, go to the grocery store, like you kind of get a feel for how that whole thing works, you know. So you go through that initial period of just really grinding, like cooking everything, you know, on a George Foreman grill, like 20 pounds of chicken on the Foreman grill, and like, you know, dozens of plastic Tupperware. And, you know, it eventually just, you know, it evolves over time. So it went from the magazines, you know, to going to, you know, the Arnold Classics and going to Venice and, you know, just seeking out, you know, these top pros and these top coaches. And then even in college, I started a team called Iron Sports. And, you know, my professor and friend of mine, Pat Davidson, you know, he came and helped coach that team. And he, you know, we created like this ecosystem and community of people that are really passionate about strength sports, bodybuilding, strongman, powerlifting. And we traveled around the country, went to competitions, just did different things like as a community where we were able to, you know, experience strength sports, you know, as a team, and in a way that I think when you're sort of in individual silos or, you know, just doing it online right now, you don't necessarily get the opportunity to get, you know, immersed in, you know, that type of, you know, that type of a community. So yeah, from there, moved to New York City, started working at a place called Peak Performance, and, you know, had a lot of injuries along the way. So of course that led me down the physical therapy route. I started studying, you know, under people like Ron Huruska with PRI, the people out of the Czech Republic with dynamic neuromuscular stabilization, DNS, out of the US, guys like Gray Cook with the FMS and SFMA. And that just kept, you know, evolving over the years. You know, where, what was it, a couple months ago, you and I went out to Oklahoma City and we studied under Tom Purvis, you know, which is, you know, significantly more specific to lifting weights and, you know, what we're actually doing in the weight room. And, you know, each time there's, you know, there's a problem, there's a roadblock, there's a question that we're trying to solve. I think it's just, you know, finding those people who have been working on that question for, you know, a few decades. As you know, one of those people was Stuart McGill. Stu's someone that's been a huge influence on me in the last year or so, and he, you know, helped me rehab back from a back injury, you know, really a series of back injuries that led to just a chronic issue. That, you know, now I wake up every day pain free. Of course, like I've modified the way that I train, but he's someone who I was studying in college, and now, you know, a decade later has, you know, come to be a good, you know, personal, like, you know, relationship, I guess I could call him, you know, friend at this point, who, you know, I'm able to just, you know, shoot a text, shoot an email, and has really made a big impact along with yourself just on my orthopedic health in this day and age.
Yeah, so a lot of interesting stuff there to potentially go down the rabbit hole of, but I want to sort of look at this now from the perspective, because I think people have a good idea of kind of your background or really what might be necessary to understand the context here. One of the things that I'm super interested in relationship to you, but maybe this also is more of a broad conversation to address, is the whole social media thing. So a lot of people, and I remember this very specifically at the 2021 Olympia, when we were at your show, we were in the audience. You know, there was whatever group of us, 8-10 of us sitting in a row, and it was very apparent to other people around us that like we were cheering for you, and you were also, you know, front and center for a large portion of the competition. So people, you know, anyone with a brain around us was like, oh, okay, these people are clearly rooting for this person. And interestingly now, most people's first reaction is not like, oh man, he looks awesome, or oh man, you guys must be so happy. It's, what is his username on Instagram? You know, where can I find him? Where can I follow him? And the most entertaining thing to me, and in some ways satisfying, was to say, oh no social media, can't be found anywhere. You know, if you Google your name, some stuff will come up, but none of it will be Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, whatever. So along the way, and along all these people that you've learned from, like all these people that you've learned from in some way are you know, just by the nature of now how things are being sold, they're online, they're on social media, whether they really like to be or not. Maybe they aren't, and they have a team that posts stuff for them, whatever. But along the way, you've never been sort of sucked into that world. And I'm really kind of interested to know, you know, especially like when things like Instagram and Facebook were initially coming out, you know, what was it that like kept you away from that? Or, you know, was it like initially you were kind of involved and then you were like, this isn't for me? I don't really know, because we've never actually talked about this more specifically. Everyone just kind of knows you, at least at our gym, as the guy who like doesn't have social media, and it seems to be working very well for you. So up to this point, not only just the, you know, two major questions here is, one is like, did you get sucked into it and you pull yourself out, or were you just never sucked into it to begin with? Number one. And then number two, what has kept you at bay, I guess, because there are lots of opportunities and upsides of, you know, doing the social media thing and being able to kind of like sell your brand and whatnot. So I'll leave it to you to kind of take that where you want, but I'm interested to know.
Yeah, and speaking of dating myself, question for you: did you ever have a MySpace account?
No, I did not have a MySpace account.
Okay, I did have a MySpace account. I do not remember
That's
what
awesome.
song. Like the way it worked is, you know, when you went onto someone's page, they had like a song associated with the page.
Like a theme song.
Uh, yeah, I mean,
Okay.
if I remembered what it was, I would not be embarrassed to say it here,
Sure.
but
Yeah,
I
sure.
unfortunately don't. If we can dig it up, if there's a way to do that, I'm sure that would be very embarrassing. But I do remember that I did have a MySpace page. I don't know how much, you know, I used it or how. Cat coming by. There we go. But I know that that existed. I know that I have a Facebook page, and it's probably the last time I was on there was maybe like 10 years or so.
Okay.
Like people will pull it up sometimes and they'll say, "Oh my God, look at like how small you were, you know, back then." And it kind of depends on what picture you're looking at. I mean, obviously, like, you know, I was natural in, you know, all those photos, and, you know, I was probably 200 and, you know, 20 some odd pounds. And there were probably times when I was as low as, you know, 200 pounds. So yeah, there's, you know, 60 to 80 pound, you know, 60 to 100 pound difference, you know, in a lot of those photos. But it's out there. I think more than anything, like, you know, I created it and then other people would post stuff. Like I remember I had it when I was out in LA for, you know, the whole athletes performance Exos deal. So there's some pictures from that.
Mhm.
But I think, you know, at the time, neither one of those were really big for business. I would say like MySpace was used by like musicians.
Oh, okay.
Um, but and that's kind of where they transitioned. I think after that, they may still exist, but it was more of just kind of like a personal thing where you just, you know, told people about your life. And I don't think it was really till like, you know, years later with Facebook, and then obviously now with Instagram, where it really became used to a high degree, like for people's businesses. So I never really made this like conscious decision not to do it. It was more just anything that I've ever done has just been because it's exciting to me and I want to do it. And there was just never that pull for me of like, oh, I enjoy this, I want to do it. It's, you know, directly making my, you know, bodybuilding better or my education better. Like I think there were always just more direct routes to the things I wanted in life. um, so I think that's really how I conceptualize a lot of this stuff. Is I have a vision of not only where I want to go, but, you know, the kind of person I want to be. And if a certain, behavior fits into that or can move me closer in that direction, then I'll engage in it, whether it be, wholly conscious, or not. It just never really fit into that. It never really moved, it didn't seem requisite in any way to move me closer to the people around me. It didn't seem requisite in any way to make me, a better bodybuilder. It didn't seem requisite to build my, in-person business with training, or, requisite to educate myself. So there was already so much of my day filled up, by those things. And all of those things, were growing in a way that, I've been happy with. So it's not that I never would have social media. For me, it would just need to enhance those parts of my life. And if it does, I'm totally open to it. But up to this point, my observation has been that on average, it doesn't do that for people. And there are certainly outliers, but if I'm making a bet, and most of my bets in those regards have gone well, it just doesn't feel like a good, investment at the time, unless I run into, some sort of roadblock. If there's some reason why I can't be a better bodybuilder, I can't be, a better husband, friend, coach, whatever, because I'm not on there, then I think I would pursue it. But at this point, it doesn't seem, overtly obvious to me that it would enhance those things.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And I think for, the listeners who I would assume 98% of them would be coming just directly from my Instagram, would kind of know me from Instagram, may also be curious about like why I sort of started making content in the first place. And I actually started making content in the first place because I was starting to get I was starting to question like why I was using the app in the first place, because, at the time I was just using it to, connect with other people who were all like, my friends in high school, or I think I got Instagram in middle school. It was just a cool thing to do. I didn't really know why I was doing it. And eventually I got to this fork in the road where I was like, I want to either I want to either stop using this app completely, or I want to start making content. I was going to go one of those two routes, which it's weird that like those would be the two options, but they were the opposite options. So I don't know, it made sense. And my brother Dan, who I think you've met once, said to me at the time, like, well, you're looking at this as like very distinct, as if like, all of your, lifting related stuff, the things that you could potentially put into content, you're looking at it as if it's different, inherently from the personal side of you, but like the lifting and the learning about anatomy and the biomechanics, like that like is me in some sense. And so that was what really got me to realize that, it wasn't like just this thing that I was using to put out content. And it's also not this thing that I'm using for, some personal thing now. And although over time it's become more of like something to use for my business, initially it really just started out as like, I just want to share what I know and like see if I can help people. And over time it's just become larger and larger, a larger scale version of that. I've obviously been able to, connect with more and more people over time. So, but I think one of the interesting things about the social media thing, and I think that I think it's important also that people question why they're using it in the first place, is understanding, that I think just the general concept of like having a reason to do something. It seems kind of silly to say it out loud, like you should have a reason to do something, but so many of the things and the habits that I think a lot of people get involved in now are just kind of like, they're just tossed into it. They're just like rolling into things, and things are just being thrown at them, and they're just absorbing it and becoming it slowly. Have I mentioned the study to you, with the monkeys, with the 5 monkeys who are being hosed in the banana at the top? Right? Have I said that to you? Have I described it to you?
No, I think I would remember.
Okay. So basically, and hopefully I'll do a good job, because if you don't understand the summary of it, then no one is going to understand the summary of it. So make sure that communication makes sense. Okay, so there are 5 monkeys, right? And they're in this cage. And they got this ladder. It's like a pretty tall ladder, and at the top there's like a bunch of bananas or whatever. Okay. And of course, one of the monkeys, whichever, I guess one of them is more intelligent, like sees the bananas and like, oh shit, like I'm gonna go get some bananas. So it starts crawling up the ladder to go reach for the bananas. And as soon as he reaches for the bananas, the experimenters hose down the other monkeys with like freezing water. Okay. So then the same thing happens. The monkey gets the banana, eats it, comes down, and then starts to go back up again. And inevitably the same thing happens, or the experimenters hose the other monkeys, or the same like other 4 monkeys that get hosed. Monkey eats the banana, comes back down. Next time the monkey goes up to, try to get the bananas, the other monkeys are like, like we had it. So they pull the monkey down, they beat the shit out of it. Okay. And over time, what ends up happening is it makes sense, like why that happens initially. But what they do is they actually one by one replace the monkeys that are in the cage. And eventually you end up in a position where all 5 of the monkeys are different monkeys than to begin with. And anytime one of them goes up to get the bananas, all of them start beating the shit out of that monkey that tries to go up. Right. So the general point being that like none of them were exposed to the initial condition. None of them understand why we don't go up this ladder. And yet all of them together understand that this is a thing that they just have to do. And I think that's how a lot of these things like social media, like social media addiction, I think that's how people end up in those positions wherein instead of thinking like, how could, to your point earlier, like, how can this actually benefit me? How can this drive me in the direction that I want to be driven? It's kind of like we're all just these monkeys that are responding to the conditions that are, set forth in a way. And we all are ultimately, the sort of replacement monkeys that don't even know why they're necessarily doing what they're doing. They just know it's like a thing that people do. And I think that applies to so many different things, more specifically in lifting, all the stuff that we like to talk about. So I thought that was just an interesting thing to throw in there. And the last thing that I wanted to cover, unless you wanted to go over some other stuff, just to kind of wrap things up in terms of the more Ethan specific talk here today, is the topic of pharmacology, because I think that a lot of times, especially in the bodybuilding space, people are either really in your face about it and talk about it nonstop, or they're like afraid to talk about it. And, it's this like niche topic that, we can't go within 20 feet of. And so I know you specifically, you started taking pharm much later on in your training journey than I think most people, do now. Most people almost, use it as a starting point rather than something to actually progress to. So just kind of, not necessarily like your general take on pharmacology, but more specifically, just, you and I were talking before this call about some of your introductions to it, some of the mistakes that you maybe made. And it doesn't have to be overly specific insofar as, the XYZ drug, but just generally, what was your introduction to pharmacology like? How did you get into it? What were the kind of thought processes that sort of went into it? And how have you sort of ended up at a place now where, you've been doing this for years and years, and you are able to guide others in doing it as well? Just kind of, timelining that sequence, I think will be helpful just for more context around you. And then also just anyone who's interested in this stuff or bodybuilding, I think will also appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, my first exposure to it really would have been around the same time as my first exposures to bodybuilding. I'll often tell people, especially, people that aren't really, haven't really been exposed to bodybuilding much, who think like, why would anyone ever want to be that, big and muscular, especially like past the point where it's like attractive. It's like the tipping point is for most people is way before even men's physique, in terms of like
Yeah.
where they're trying to get to. It's really like a modeling competition. And even that, like, it's funny what girls are like actually, I think, attracted to in a lot of ways. Obviously, there's much more than just like the physical appearance, but it's like barely abs. It's not necessarily like this just like chiseled physique or like anything beyond like a 14-inch arm. It's like usually like the skater boy kind of situation more so than it is like, the meathead.
Yeah.
So like with that being said, I remember looking at the magazines, you know, when I was, you know, first starting to lift, seeing, you know, Ronnie Coleman just super fucking veiny, like 24-inch arms, you know, on the cover of like a Muscular Development. And never once did I think like, oh, that's what I want to look like, because I think that looks really cool. Like I know there's a lot of guys who got into bodybuilding because of like certain movies, like, you know, seeing Arnold growing up in the movies, or Stallone, or, you know, especially comic books, you know, people looking at like, you know, the Hulk and Superman, and maybe they were, you know, got picked on as a kid, or they just related to these stories about someone who was, you know, big and strong, and, you know, that gave them some level of like self-confidence. Um, and it really wasn't, that wasn't really part of my journey in terms of like thinking about the physique specifically. Like I want to grow up to look like, you know, Ronnie Coleman someday. I can imagine if you grew up in like the 70s and you saw Arnold, where you're like, yeah, like Arnold's on the beach, you know, like holding up these two chicks, and like he's, you know, smoking a joint and like just living the good life. I was watching like Dorian Yates, you know, train in a basement, and like with, I don't know, a place where I picture having like hypodermic needles and like rats running around, and I'm like,
Yeah.
that's the life. You know, if you look back at the ads at that time, like the Animal Pack ads, it was all around this idea of like suffering, you know, is the key to redemption, you know, kind of thing. So
Yeah.
anyway, like my inroad into the whole bodybuilding thing was not so much about the physique. And, you know, I'm sure in other episodes we'll get into, you know, the mental side of bodybuilding, you know, some of my influences there. Ultimately, when we do consults with people, that'll come up as well. But this is just to say that like the driver for me was more always of like the journey of self-exploration, you know, of developing a level of self-efficacy, and you know, a certain amount of you know, control over like the things that, you know, were happening in my life. Um, so I tried, you know, football, and, you know, at one point I played, you know, basketball, if you can, you know, imagine that, and
No.
hockey and lacrosse and rugby, you name it. It just so happens that bodybuilding was the thing that like I you know, I had an opportunity to, you know, be decent at. And it really could have been anything, but it was never about wanting to look a certain way. It was just about pursuing something that I enjoyed, and moving, you know, being able to put effort into something that I could see a direct result from. So I was never under the impression at any point that, you know, people like, you know, Ronnie's kind of always, I guess, the example that I keep using here, but I don't think anyone at this point is like, oh my God, you know, Ronnie Coleman's, you know, not natural. So I'm not trying to throw like him under the bus. It's just, you know, he's never going to listen to this. if he ever did, like, it's only because he's the greatest of all time that he's the first person that comes to my mind, you know, from a physique perspective.
Yeah.
But it was always something that I was aware of. The coach that I was working with worked with, you know, the top bodybuilders in the world. And because it was never about the physique, it wasn't ever about having to get there so quickly. So it wasn't simply like, oh, because these pros, you know, are taking gear and I want to look like these guys. It wasn't so much that I needed to look like them. I just wanted to go through that same journey. So the journey didn't really require me to be enhanced. You know, I could have, you know, I have, you know, I competed naturally. I have a ton of respect for guys who do it naturally. And the only reason I really crossed over was the same reasons we discussed a minute ago with social media. If I asked the question, would bodybuilding be more interesting, more exciting? You know, would I have an opportunity to pursue what I just mentioned as my initial mission, which is to be able to see the output of, the effort I was putting in? Could I see change? Could I manifest, a difference? And at a certain point, again, I started training around, 13 or so. By the time I was 26, 27 years old, you're not really making a whole lot of changes after training really hard, eating lots of food, like living the lifestyle for over a decade. So that decision for me was not so much a decision of like, I need to look a particular way. I see that final look is not necessarily something that you decide per se. You're putting in inputs along the way. You do the training, you eat the food, you take the drugs, like those kind of surface level things, which are all sort of encompassed in, building a lifestyle, building a community, like building a schedule, building a vision, and doing that with just this dogged level of consistency over time. And it produces something, and you don't know what that thing's gonna look like. You're just watering this plant, it's getting sunshine, in the right soil. Like if you're lucky enough to be born in the right soil, maybe you're an oak tree.
Yeah.
But if you're not, maybe you're a dandelion, and like just be the best fucking dandelion you can. And that's why I wore this shirt today, was for, for that analogy specifically, of course.
Yeah.
And I've made a couple, visual references throughout this podcast to the cat walking by, and now the dandelion shirt, which I'm sure will be over the heads of anyone listening to this on audio. But just know there was a reason. So yeah, and anyway, I just totally made that analogy up off the top of my head. But the idea is like, look, you don't get to choose how you look at the end of all this. All you get to choose is the inputs you put in. And from that perspective, the output is not that important to me. It brings a lot of interesting things, like, by being successful at anything, it attracts people to you. It brings you opportunities you wouldn't otherwise have had. But if you find the things that you're naturally drawn to, both from the perspective of it's interesting, exciting to you, but it's also something that you maybe have a knack for, I think eventually, when you put that level of passion and effort towards something that you already have an inclination towards, cool stuff's going to come out of it. You just don't get to choose what that stuff's going to be. So I think in a lot of ways, especially, as I've done this more and more years, like I come to terms with the fact that like, I don't really get to choose how this thing looks. And by this thing, it's like, I mean my physique, but I also mean kind of like the story, that we're on here. Like you and I didn't choose to meet each other. Like it just happened. And because we're people who have, strong interests, passion and a high level of effort that we put into the things, that we're interested and passionate in, we're reasonably interesting people who, when we come together, we have stuff to share. And that, creates new things. And we just can't simply imagine, where those things would take us. So, coming full circle, which seems so lateral to this idea of pharmacology, but really it's just how I would think about anything is, pharmacology is simply another one of those tools that can be used to enhance an experience, and not, acutely, like you want to feel a particular way, or, you want to just like, get ready for a high school reunion or something like that. Not that there's any issue with that. Like if you defined what you want to do, who you want to be, and what the right tool to do that is, like, good on you. But I will often, like a few days ago, someone in the sauna was asking me, should they start, taking drugs? Someone like, unsurprisingly, who looked like this is kind of their first, year of lifting and everything. And if we're in a situation where it's not just like passing by in the street, but maybe like we're in a sauna where there's some time to pass.
Very intimate. Very intimate setting.
Yeah. Like you have some time to kind of like, tell this story. And really the story is just simply like anything that you want to do, you're just kind of weighing the, the cost benefit. And for me, knowing that there are, health consequences and that potentially it impacts, there can be some impacts on lifespan and health span, but much the same way as I would look at, like being the CEO of a company, or, totally lateral to that, like smoking a joint. This guy kind of seemed like he would relate to that. So I happen to use that as an analogy. I'm like, look, if I, get high on a Saturday night with, my wife and my friends, like I realize that that's probably not like a direct benefit, to my physical health. But I weigh that against, the fact that it leads to interesting experiences. We laugh a lot together, when we do it, relax, sleep well. And when I think about the things that, I want in life, like those are a big part of it. So it's the same thing that I found with pharmacology. Like it cannot give you any of those things. It's not like a pass to say, if you take steroids, like you're going to be a more fulfilled person. Most likely, if that's what you think, it will be the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
But that whatever that tool is, whether it's, starting a business, whether it's, smoking a joint, or whether it's, taking a shot, in your right glute, like if that's very in line with what you understand your mission to be, and much like social media we talked about earlier, like if that can enhance the mission, and you can directly see how it's expanding those things in your life, then I think it makes sense. And I can honestly look back over the last, like 3-4 years of use and just say like, yeah, it directly, fit in with those things. I first of all built a very strong foundation of those things first, and because that foundation was there, I already had people that supported me. I already had the financial stability to be able to do that sort of stuff. So with all that stability there, it enhanced it. Without all that stability there, it's much like having a shoddy car, right? Like you put a big engine in it and bad things are going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be kind of, I think, the moral of the story is just like, if you want to go cross country, you should probably have somewhat of a roadmap, and you should probably make sure that your car, the passengers, like the gas in the tank, like all those things are kind of in check first, before you go on that journey, and before you supercharge that car and put some nitrous on it, because
Mm-hmm.
only bad things are going to happen with a city car and a tank full of nitrous.
Well, you're full of the analogies, which I think the viewer, the listener will like. So just to kind of bring this full circle, full circle. I think that, well, for one, over time, I have not been able to predict what the kinds of things that you'll say to more accuracy, but more so I can somewhat start to predict what kinds of things you won't say. And I was not expecting the answer to that question to be that you wanted to get bigger, I knew it would be more all encompassing. So I think that's very useful context to anyone who's thinking about it. And I think that it's a perspective that is very seldom expressed on social media, if anywhere at all. So I think that to kind of draw some kind of similarity to that as well is like what I noticed in my own experiences in terms of, because really ultimately what you're describing in terms of the process over the outcome, we hear so many people say, okay, you don't be outcome oriented, be, involved, be in the process, work hard every day, don't focus on the end goal. It's like, well, to some degree you have to have some end goal, right? You need to at least know a direction. But I think that the bigger, broader, I think, more important point that you're making is that the goal is ultimately, not whether you win or lose, but how you play the game, that kind of a thing. And so I think the goal is ultimately not just to improve the way that you play the game, but to continue to play the game over, completely different iterations of experiences in terms of the problems that you're facing and the people that you're interacting with, and how those two things come together. So I think that a good connection, especially with another person, is it's someone who, like pharmacology to bodybuilding, might enhance the way that the game is played, and not only enhance every sort of step to that process, but just the overall experience and what you take away from it. So I think that's a really good point to kind of conclude here. I'm really excited to get on a regular schedule with this and continue to see where it goes. And I think if anyone who is listening has made it to this point, you're the real ones, an hour in or whatever it is. And specifically to those people listening now, because this will be a good sort of way to, well, I guess I don't know when we're going to release this, but the goal with this is to kind of just allow it to, much like in the sense of all these other things we've been talking about, just kind of develop however it's going to develop. So as I mentioned earlier, we'll plan to have guests on that are quote unquote experts in whatever field. I think it'll be fun to kind of talk to those people on occasion, but I also think it'll be super beneficial just to do consultations, live in podcast format with anyone, whether someone, is a bodybuilder or a personal trainer, whoever it happens to be, physical therapist. I think it'll be really cool to talk to, people we've never met. So we're meeting new people, and we're also exposing, those people specifically to answers they haven't heard, and, potentially, different ideas for everyone who hasn't, heard them before. So that's where I'll kind of wrap things up, unless you had anything, that you wanted to finish up with.
Yeah, I think on that note with like the consultations,
Yeah.
The idea for me had a lot to do with how I've come to learn over the years, which is, as you mentioned earlier, I have sort of Rolodex, or a list of coaches that, I reach out to, some on like a bi-weekly basis, some only every few months. Those people range from experts in pharmacology to experts in biomechanics like yourself and Tom, to there's people that I work with on the stress management and psychological standpoint. And I've found, you can, in terms of, getting information, from these experts, oftentimes they put out information through several avenues, right? They may have, social media account, which obviously, I'm not, completely privy to. They may have books that they've written, whether ebooks, or in print, podcasts, like this. And oftentimes, for certain experts, they'll do Q&As. So in terms of like audio content, right now I see, podcasts, we have this long form content on one end. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have social media that's going to be a lot more short form. And I think there's a lot to be garnered by the longer form content, like a podcast, where you can really dive deep into a specific topic. And I know you and I have talked about some of the podcasts that we really enjoy that are long form content, really diving deep. Like recently, it's been people talking about things like training at long muscle lengths, for example. And it may be, again, on my side of things, like it may be also about, pharmacology or nutrition, where it's like, this is what that person does. There may be no 20% about the other stuff, but they're up at night, spending 80% of their time thinking about this topic. I think between the two of us, like this podcast today has been very broad, kind of philosophical in nature. Ultimately, when we actually speak to people in person, some of that comes out, but we also actually get down to, the bare bones details, which we plan to do with these consults. But what I've found in, connecting with these experts is that when you're just listening to them talk about, in a long form, whether it be a seminar or a podcast about how they conceptualize things, how they might approach a topic, you don't get to see what they actually do. And I've done internships and mentorships, like have, you know, flown out to just seen so many people over the years and actually watch what they do, whether that be them working on me, or it be just observing them, you know, working with, you know, their athletes or clients. And when you get to see people problem solve and answer very specific questions, and not just a one-time answer like you get on a Q&A, where someone from afar sends something in and they just get, you know, whatever you interpret their question to be back, there's a lot lost in that translation. So it's been vital for me over the years to connect with these coaches directly. And then when I ask a question, very rarely is it just they give an answer and it's like, that's all there is. Usually there's some dialogue where it's like, you ask a question, they give an answer, you give a little bit more context that might change their answer. That question leads to more questions. And ultimately, that's usually what we're doing here. It's just getting better and better questions. So I think this idea of bringing people on that have, you know, questions that are, you know, pretty relevant to, you know, the rest of your listeners, and giving them a chance to actually have dialogue. I think that dialogue is something that's not being captured right now. And there's going to be a lot revealed in that back and forth that gets missed when it's just a Q&A or it's just someone doing long form content. You actually get to see how, you know, we would apply these things in the real world. And I haven't specifically seen that being done outside of the consultations that I do with the people that I work with, who I'm sure are people that we can bring on as well.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason that will be so valuable is because what people take away isn't this, you know, not necessarily cookie cutter answer, because you know, I think you can expand a lot just in, you know, not having someone face to face. Like, you can give a lot of detail, but again, it might not be specific to the person or the context or whatever. But I think the value in that back and forth process is extrapolating like what is the actual process that takes place here, rather than what are the X's and O's only. Because when you just are delivered and fed information, like reading a book, you know, you potentially get a lot of information from reading a book, but it's not until you actually you know, get to talk to the author, you know, in an example like that, or until you actually see something that's practically applied or is happening in real time in your life, where you actually internalize that information and then you can use it across scenarios. You don't just get this one answer that you know, receive this one time in this one way. So that's certainly the benefit of the long form thing. And I think in addition to that, the back and forth. So yeah, it's super fun stuff. I'm excited to move forward from here. So we will wrap this one up, and whenever this is released, who knows if it's going to be one a week, one every 2 weeks, one every other day. Could, you know, we'll keep everyone on their toes as far as release dates. But I will be putting stuff out in my stories and everything, so we can, you know, get some people on here probably next week. So yeah.